Sustainability is a rising topic in many areas of our lives today, like reducing our carbon footprint or using less straws. But have you ever thought about what's being done to keep our agriculture sustainable? In the next couple of minutes, I'll be sharing with you the current practices in our agricultural system, as well as some sustainable options. To paraphrase the United States Department of Agriculture's statement on sustainable agriculture, which I accessed from their website on November 2nd, they said that sustainable agriculture is important to increase production, protect the environment, and to ensure economic viability for these systems. After studying different scholarly articles that focus on practices and reading through the environmental science textbook Toward a Sustainable Future, I've gained a solid understanding of the different practices and techniques used today. I'll first be explaining the most current practices, and I will share what their sustainable alternatives are and how they're implemented, and also how they compare to our current ones. Now let's move right into the current agricultural practices used by many farmers. One of the most popular forms of farming revolves around the use of a monoculture. Monocultures are farms that produce one type of crop. In the example I have above, you can see that a cornfield, which we commonly see in Pennsylvania, is an example of a monoculture. Monocultures not only decrease biodiversity of the ecosystem, but they also inhibit natural processes that rejuvenate soil, protect other crops, and also just support a natural system overall. The example I have listed here is fertilization. Fertilization in many farms take place because the monocultures can't rejuvenate their soil on their own, and instead are need to manually be placed. According to the textbook Environmental Science Toward a Sustainable Future, published in 2014, monocultures have no natural protection against pests. Thus, farmers have to heavily rely on pesticides. As of recently, the use of pesticides is increasing because pests are becoming more resistant. This is known as the pesticide treadmill. And as a result, farmers have to use even more pesticides to combat that resistance. On here, I have listed on the top right a caution sign on a farm, which is commonly seen when pesticides are applied. And on the bottom left, I have an example of a common pest, which is the Colorado potato beetle. As stated in the textbook I cited earlier, there are many forms of irrigation systems for agriculture, yet many farmers focus on two different processes. The first is known as flood irrigation. Flood irrigation is a process that doesn't conserve water that well. This type of irrigation uses freshwater sources like river water or groundwater in order to supply the field. It works by having a barrier along a field and then flooding that barrier with water. In the picture I have here, you can see the tube of water goes across the field and it just floods it continually. Another form of current irrigation is center pivot irrigation. Center pivot irrigation pumps water through a sprinkler from groundwater, and it does this constantly. As water is being sprinkled onto the field, the surface area of water is increased, and thus evaporation also increases. As evaporation increases, that's less water that can percolate into the soil. Thus, more water is used than what is needed. Groundwater resources are considered non-renewable because they take centuries to fully replenish, and it's for that reason that farmers need to be careful of how much water they use. In the pictures I have here on the bottom, center pivot irrigation has a very large sprinkler contraption that expands across the entire field and circles out wide. The groundwater source picture you can see at the top left shows a groundwater reservoir, which water is pumped from the ground into a local reservoir for farmers. Since we discussed the processes of current agricultural practice in many farms, let's now move on to the alternatives that can be applied through sustainable systems. One agricultural model that is adopted by many is the polyculture. A polyculture is the exact opposite of a monoculture. Instead of focusing on one crop, it focuses on the diversity of many. This diversity is supposed to resemble an ecosystem. As you can see here on the top left, I have a picture of a polyculture. In a polyculture, you can see that each row of plants, or each row in the farm, have different plants. And these plants are repeated in a pattern so that biodiversity is held constant throughout the whole field. Connecting to the use of polyculture, one aspect of integrated pest management is the use of diversity in order to repel plants. For example, marigolds are used in many gardens in order to repel pests because of their chemical makeup and their scent. At the same time, according to an article written by authors Botrol and Schonley, plants can indirectly control pest populations. They do this by becoming the homes of their predators. Based off Doval's article on integrated pest management published on January 5th, 2019, other integrated pest management techniques include cultural, genetic, and natural chemical control, which are used first rather than pesticides. In the pictures you can see here in the middle, I have the IPM strategies that are used, and on the right, another example of a plant that repels pests, which is mint. Although many farms focus on using flood and center pivot irrigation, there are many alternate methods, and I'll be focusing on 3. The first is called surge flow irrigation. Surge flow irrigation is exactly like flood irrigation, but instead of running water continuously, it is run periodically. This has been said to cut water use by about half. You can see here on the bottom, I have surge flow irrigation. It looks exactly like the setup for flood irrigation, just except, like I said, it is run periodically. The next is drip irrigation. And drip irrigation runs and works by having a network of tubes that connect to plants and waters it. This type of irrigation has been shown to reduce water use by 30 to 70%. And finally, we have the treadle pump. The treadle pump is a foot pump used commonly in developing countries and is very good for these locations because the water tables are really shallow and allow water to be brought up easily. So you can see here on the top left, I have the treadle pump being used, and on the right, drip irrigation in action. And it looks as complicated as it sounds. To recap, I have gone over the current practices of agriculture today and the techniques that are sustainable that can be implemented into our systems. Remember, as we progress into the future, it's important to manage our resources. Thus, these sustainable systems are vital in order to protect our environment, promote our agricultural systems, and protect our future. Now, the next time you refuse a plastic straw or try to be more environmentally conscious, I hope that you can remember there's more ways to be sustainable than you thought.